Ship crewman, what was the creepiest experience you had out on the ocean? Not a ship, but, you know in the movies the creaking sounds on a submarine from the pressure when going deep, the first time you hear them for real is a bit unnerving. I got to see glowing algae on top of the ocean in the middle of the night, having a smoke on the upper decks after my watch on a warship, surreal and extremely uncommon but a memory I'll have for the rest of my life. Came upon an empty life raft in the middle of the Atlantic. In all likelihood it was probably an accidental discharge. Maybe a crew member was ducking around with the release or something. Who knows? The implications otherwise are very disturbing though. Did a ship go down with all hands without anyone making it to the raft? Was the raft abandoned for some reason? It left me feeling vaguely disturbed for a while afterwards. Not a crewman myself, but I'm fortunate enough to know a lovely guy called Ron Warwick, who was the captain of Cunard's Queen Elizabeth II liner for years. I once asked him what the oddest thing he'd ever seen at sea was. His reply was precisely this: I saw a wave once. It was quite big. I have to say I was a bit disappointed. I mean, we've all seen big waves, but a mutual friend suggested I look it up. It turns out, Ron was talking about this monster, rogue wave. Deep fog. Like I couldn't see the front of the yacht, sailing. And it was only 50 foot. The real creepy part came from the radar system tracking the boats and ships around us. Our radar, not being a commercial shipping or fisherman spec, was not quite as accurate, so sometimes boats would disappear, be right on top of us, or appear in sight but not on radar. That, on top of the sheer quantity of marine debris throughout the ocean, made me really scared that some boats had sunk when they dropped off radar. Worked for a bit as a deckhand on fishing boats out of San Diego. A few times we would come across deserted smaller boats, pangas, drifting with outlandishly big motors. Every time the captain would just cut hard port or starboard to get away from them as quick as possible. I knew they were drug running boats that had probably dropped off their cargo, but I would check them out with the binoculars if we were close. One had 2 people on it, both had clearly been shot a bunch of times, and one was moving and fairly alive. I told the captain, got a disapproving head shake, and we were on our way. The doldrums. You spend a year or two at sea watching the waves and winds are blowing constantly, and then one day they stop. Not so much as a whisper of wind, and the sea is like glass. It feels as if time has stopped. Realizing how creepy it feels, the captain calls for an all stop and goes dead in the water. Like a horror movie, everyone migrates topside and just stares to the horizon. No one says a word and you can hear yourself breathe. He lets the ship rest there for an hour and the sailors freak out. Panic can set in quickly with a green crew. The only thing the captain says when we get underway is, "Men, this is the doldrums." Bastard knew what he was doing. We did a man overboard drill on the way to Hawaii, which includes throwing a dummy into the water. I went portside to see the experience in less than 1 minute, and by the time I reached the water there was already a 8-foot shark waiting near the dummy. Found a sailboat adrift after a storm in the Atlantic with nobody aboard. We decided to tow it to Florida. A couple of us went aboard to attach the line. There was a foot of water and tons of bondage porn floating around in it. Never found out who the owner was. Reported it in Key West and left it in the harbor. My dad told me this story once. He spent a year fishing off the coast of Alaska. One night he and another boat were racing to get the last slip. The other would have to moor in the harbor for the night. That night there was a storm and the fish in the bottom of the boat moored in the harbor all slid to one side and capsized the boat. My dad woke up the next morning to find the entire boat's crew had drowned in their sleep. Cousin is a ship captain or something. One time they were loading cargo from Bandar Abbas Bay in Iran to transport to Abu Dhabi in the UAE. A cat had climbed on board without anyone noticing. Halfway through the Persian Gulf she began meowing like crazy and they all legit got spooked. Some started saying ghosts or thinking they were legit sailing in haunted waters. After 3 hours of shipmates searching like crazy they finally found her hiding between cargo containers. They dropped her off in Abu Dhabi as an illegal immigrant. Not me, but my chief engineer always recalls a story of when Arab died while cleaning a cargo tank due to the fumes. He said having lunch with him a few minutes prior to everyone running G out on deck to see what the emergency was to only make it there as his lifeless body was dragged out the manhole was the eeriest feeling ever. They were well offshore as well, so their only option was to store his body in one of the walk-in coolers. They just wrapped his body in a bedsheet and plopped him down on the floor of it, no different than if he were the rack of ribbies they had thawing out made getting your milk in the morning for your cereal very difficult. Not creepy but gross. I was chumming and cutting bait at 5 AM on Jeffrey's Ledge in New England. I kept hearing weird splashing sounds every few minutes, but it was still dark. I was a noob at the time. Around 530 I could see a little better but not great. I think I kept seeing a boy looking like a giant road cone popping up out of the water, then it would disappear again. I was full on WTF. Captain comes out on deck and catches me staring off into the sea. He looks out. A road cone pops up a few hundred yards off. He looks back at me and starts laughing his ass off. How long you been watching that whale masturbate? Humpback whales masturbate by rolling around on the surface of the water using the splash as friction. TLDR. I watched a whale jerk off for one stroke to an hour. US Marine here. During a float on a boat to operation. Top secret. Destination. Unknown. One of our own were lost at sea. I guess they just jumped overboard at night or something. Kinda depressing. That's a shitty way to die. Anyways, their coffin rack was adjacent to mine, and we left the rack made, and for some reason, the sheets kept on getting messed up every day. It was pain in the ass to keep making the sheets. We stripped the rack, and we figured that no one should be sleeping in there since there were plenty of other vacant racks in the berthing. But someone would keep making the rack, and messing the sheets up in the morning. I know aircraft carriers are big, but could someone really fake their own death on one and get away with it? There's no way someone would be sleeping there, because we'd notice someone climbing up on the top bunk, and the duty would have been posted at the entrances to the berthing. It was just creepy seeing the rack being made neatly and then messed up in the morning. I was on ship during Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf of Mexico. During the worst of it, the wind made the most eeriest noises and the ship was creaking and making all sorts of metal on metal noises a ship shouldn't make. Halfway through an 8-month deployment we found ourselves in a dense fog in the middle of calm seas. The way the fog was sitting made it look like a soft white sand beach was about 30 feet away from the ship. I had such a strong urge to jump off the ship and swim to that little white sand beach that I had to force myself to go below deck. I knew, deep down, that there was no beach, but my eyes and brain were telling me that was what I was looking at, and the peace I imagined sitting on that little beach was incredibly tempting. Two stowaways decided that it would be a good idea to crawl up the anchor chain of our Panamax tanker. To give you an idea, each link weighs 365 pounds, and hide in the anchor chain locker. We relocated on order of port authorities and Ray dropped anchor. Dropping anchor is basically that. You just let gravity do its thing, with a bit of braking. Next thing we know is that red mush is coming out of the hawse hole. Basically those guys were stuck in a room where 365 pound pieces of steel are thrown everywhere. Had to send a few Filipinos down into the anchor locker with a power washer to clean out the rest. I was on a research vessel south of the Solomon Islands after a cyclone had torn the place to shreds. Come 3 AM it's time to lower the instrument, a CTD with Niskin bottle rosette for those interested, and turn on the searchlights over the quarterdeck. The ocean surface is awash with coconut palms, bits of wood, outdoor furniture and so on. The islands had been swept clean and the ship was sitting in a vast field of floating debris. Mesmerized by this I kept staring at it all when I noticed a small pink shape with what appeared to be arms, legs and a head. My heart almost stopped beating. A child? Closer inspection revealed it was a child's doll, but for those few seconds, horrific. I worked as a deckhand on a private 53 feet yacht. I helped deliver it from the east coast of the US to the Virgin Islands with a pit stop in Bermuda. En route to Bermuda, I wake up and head up to accompany the guy on watch and he looks pretty disturbed and points up. Our cockpit had a cloth bimini with a plastic window in the top roof thing over the helm for you non-nautical folks. On the plastic window are 2 boot prints in the salt residue. There's no way anyone could stand on the bimini, it's cloth and would have broken. We never figured out how it happened and the captain brushed it off. Prob so I wouldn't be freaked out since it was my first time at sea. Not terrifying. Definitely weird. It could have been a prank, but no one was laughing. and who would risk losing their boots overboard for a stupid prank? My buddy and I were about 20 miles west of the Lower Keys, in the Gulf of Mexico. We were on his boat looking for dolphin and wahoo when we see a boat in the distance heading our direction. We weren't under power or anything, just drifting and drinking beer. The boat gets closer and we see smoke. It was pretty much a burned out cabin at that point, but still running. It just idled by. We yank our lines up and go run it down. Luckily no charred corpses that I could see. I kick it into neutral with a gaff and we decided to see where it came from. On the way we reported its location to Coast Guard. We drove that general direction for probably 10 miles. Didn't see a single thing. No other boats. No life jackets. Nothing. Hopefully the people who were on that boat were picked up safely. It was like something from Walking Dead. Just a burned out boat floating on by. I sail on tull ships with temp crews of young people, 16-18 usually. We discourage ghost creepy stories because there's always some kid who gets inspired and takes it too far. And between rig climbing and weather and the general danger of being at sea, we really don't want that. So no outright creepy stuff. But the sea can be plenty eerie. Being in thick fog and hearing sounds that seem close by, but usually aren't, can be pretty chilling. Buoys that have sound signals can sound spooky as hell. The way the eye tries to make sense of distances when the sea is mostly flat can be really alarming. Look out, I thought that thing was a mile off and now it is at our bow. Then there is the time we were in the middle of the Atlantic and the main anchor started letting out just after I came off evening watch. I dashed out of the mess and onto the foredeck to ram on the brakes, which turned out later to be about 2-3 seconds before the anchor and chain combined would have been too heavy to haul back in. We had been pounding in an 8-meter swell for days, so I assumed the brakes and the slip must have just rattled loose in the relentless motion. But the bosun swore up and down that he'd double secured the slip with rope and that there was no way it could have come loose on its own. Had a friend go out night diving in Wellington Harbor. Turned around in the water and saw monstrous great white swimming straight toward him. Turned his flash off. For some reason. Not exactly a crewman but spent a lot of time out fishing with my dad when I was young. Scariest thing was a whale breaching like 10 meters away from us. My jocks were ducking well dirty. Being in the Navy we stood a lot of watch. One night I'm on off lookout and I see this light pattern. Formatting purpose. PLZ ignore. Full stop. Full stop. Full stop. Full stop. The left light goes out. A right light comes on. All the lights stay stationary, so it wasn't like it was just turning. We called it into the bridge sick. There was nothing on the radar, but I had a witness with me. This was over 30 years ago. We were living aboard a 22 feet a day our first boat. We pulled into a dock and were trying to sleep. We heard the crackling sound, almost like twigs burning. Was very concerning. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with my boat. Our neighbor didn't help. He said it was fiberglass worms. Apparently, this is some mollusk that attaches itself to the hull and clicks in some way that the hull picked up and amplified. We had a naval chief petty officer die of a heart attack while underway on board our sub. Since we were doing spec ops off the USSR coastline, we could not surface and come off station for 60 days. So, every time we had to go into the freezer to get food, there was the chief laying on the shelf with his eyes wide open and frozen. He was wrapped in a cling wrap material so you could see his face clearly. So, next time you open your freezer at night, just think of having to look at someone's face looking back at you. I've spent about 9 years out at sea and there were a couple of things that stuck with me. The very worst was a colleague hanging himself overboard on purpose, going next to a tornado off the coast of Taiwan and the massive waves around us. Hearing a PA from the captain to pick up a heavy tool and head on to the back of the ship next to the handrail, and it was not a drill. Turned out a ship that went past us in the opposite direction changed direction and started following us. Nothing came out of it. The very last one I remember was hearing a splash and start looking overboard to spot what fell in the water only to realize it's dolphins playing. Not saw, but heard. Well, that's not entirely true. Another crew member did claim he saw another boat right around sunset, but I never saw it. Anyway, I'm alone on the bridge of this private yacht I worked on. I wanted the bridge time and the only time to get it was at night as I was the new guy. So I'm on the bridge alone and I'm messing with the radio just out of boredom. All of a sudden I hear a little girl's voice asking if there's anyone out there. I respond normally. Ask if she needs anything. I'm assuming she's playing with dad's radio. She says she hasn't heard from anyone in a really long time. Says she's been at sea for what seems like forever. I ask her if she's with her family, and she says they're here, but they won't talk to her anymore. She says they're all, and this really creeped me out, all getting really angry and screaming at each other all the time. I ask the name of her boat and she tells me the name of a ship I knew to have sunk 6 years ago in the same area. I'm really creeped out now, considering waking someone up. I asked her if she needs anything, and her reply still haunts me. She says I need about $350. Was on a fishing trip off the coast of Oregon. This was about a year after the big tsunami in Japan. The captain saw something off in the distance, so we went to look. It was a small refrigerator with Japanese writing on it. Just creepy to know that probably washed out of someone's apartment. In the Navy. Finding flying fish on the 04 level, about 40 feet above the water, after a pretty big storm, or the one very hot day in the middle of the Gulf. I went outside to see some daylight. It can get a little unnerving being inside a ship with no windows, so it's nice to see the sun every so often. Anyway, I was standing by the two SUS guns when all of a sudden I heard two loud, chest punching explosions. I thought the hot temperatures cooked off the 20mm rounds in the guns. I ducked like an idiot. I ran back inside to hear someone complaining about a jet flying by at supersonic speeds. I never heard the exhaust or any sound from the jet, just the sonic boom.